is to act crazy, and then he won't want me here. So coming out of that situation, he wrote this psalm. And so we're going to read this morning because it does speak some truth as to why David finds himself again living in the enemy camp just a few years later. But so often when God brings us out of something and saves us radically, we have such a deep, clear picture of reality. And we're going to look at that. Psalm 34. I will praise the Lord at all times. I will constantly speak his praises. I will boast only in the Lord. Let all who are helpless take heart. Come, let us tell of the Lord's greatness. Let us exalt his name together. I prayed to the Lord, and he answered me. He freed me from all my fears. Those who look to him for help will be radiant with joy. No shadow of shame will darken their faces. In my desperation I prayed, and the Lord listened. He saved me from all my troubles. For the angel of the Lord is a guard. He surrounds and defends all who fear him. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Oh, the joys of those who take refuge in him. Fear the Lord, you his godly people, for those who fear him will have all they need. Even strong young lions sometimes go hungry, but those who trust in the Lord will lack no good thing. Come, my children, and listen to me, and I will teach you to fear the Lord. Does anyone want to live a life that is long and prosperous? Then keep your tongue from speaking evil and your lips from telling lies. Turn away from evil and do good. Search for peace and work to maintain it. The eyes of the Lord watch over those who do right. His ears are open to their cries for help. But the Lord turns his face against those who do evil. He will erase their memory from the earth. The Lord hears his people when they call to him for help. He rescues them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed. The righteous person faces many troubles, but the Lord comes to the rescue each time. For the Lord protects the bones of the righteous, not one of them is broken. Calamity will surely destroy the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be punished. But the Lord will redeem those who serve him. No one who takes refuge in him will be condemned. You know, after writing a psalm like this and having such a dramatic experience of God rescuing him from a wrong choice, it's pretty ironic that he ends up in the same town under the same king in Philistine territory, his enemy's territory. But as we've talked about it, if you were spending 10 years of life as a refugee, living in caves, hiding in the wilderness, living day by day, running from Saul from place to place to place, all of us at some point would say, I just want comfort. I just want stability. I just want normalcy. And so that's ultimately David's choice. If you remember back in that passage of Scripture, it talked about David thought unto himself. He decided to go back and live in Philistine territory because he didn't consult God. He believed the lie that Saul was eventually going to get him, and the safest place was once again in his enemy's camp. How quickly did David forget his own words? Let me read verses 12 through 14 again. Does anyone want to live a life that is long and prosperous? Then keep your tongue from speaking evil and your lips from telling lies. Turn away from evil and do good. Search for peace and work to maintain it. There's a huge difference between having wisdom and being wise. A huge difference. David knew what to do. He'd experienced God's faithfulness. But knowing is not always what we act on. Knowing is not always what we believe. And David, in his second experience in the Philistine camp, in order to keep his comfort and his protection and his safety, had to live by a lie. He had to encourage and get King Achish to believe that he was acting against his own tribe, against his own people. And so he kept going out on raiding parties, and he'd come back with spoils from those raiding parties and telling King Achish that he had raided his homeland, when in reality he had raided whole other villages and whole other people groups and wiped them out, left no survivors whatsoever. And so in order to perpetuate his own protection and his own safety and his own comfort, he had to lie, kill, and destroy. And the last chapter began like this. About that time, the Philistines mustered their armies for another war with Israel. King Achish told David, you and your men will be expected to join me in battle. Very well, David agreed. Now you'll see for yourself what we can do. Then Achish told David, I will make you my personal bodyguard for life. You see, Achish had given him a whole city, a city of Ziklag. And so David and his men and their families lived in relative comfort. But then his lies caught up to him, right? Finally, the Philistines and King Achish decided that they were going to war with Israel. And King Achish says, hey, I want you to join me in this battle, David. And David goes, great. Now you can see what I can do. Oh, I can't wait to fight my people, right? Like, he's caught. He's caught in his lie. So the rest of last chapter, we looked at Saul. We're going to jump right back into David here at the beginning of chapter 29. The entire Philistine army now mobilized at Aphek, and the Israelites camped at the spring in Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers were leading out their troops in groups of hundreds and thousands, David and his men marched at the rear with King Achish. But the Philistine commanders demanded, what are these Hebrews doing here? And Achish told them, this is David, the servant of King Saul of Israel. He's been with me for years, and I've never found a single fault in him from the day he arrived until today. But the Philistine commanders were angry. Send him back to the town you've given him, they demanded. He can't go into battle with us. What if he turns against us in battle and becomes our adversary? Is there any better way for him to reconcile himself with his master than by handing our heads over to him? Isn't this the same David about whom the women of Israel sing their dances? Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. David wisely, as he's going into battle, does not put himself on the front lines. He sets himself up at the back of the army, right? And we're not told what his plans are. We're not told whether or not he planned to turn on his new friends when it was in the fray of battle, or if he decided when everything was going to get started, he was just going to squeak out the back door while the battle was going on. Either way, he has geared up his Hebrews. And so all these other Philistine commanders are ordering together and forming their hundreds and thousands of men, and they see a people group in the midst of their army that doesn't look like everybody else. In fact, they look a lot like their enemy. And they say, what are these guys doing here? And King Achish says, this is David. He's Saul's servant. He's on our side. We've been buddies for years. He kind of accentuates the point a little bit. David's only been in his service 16 months, and before that he was crazy, right? Oh, he's good. He's fine. You can trust him. David has him so fooled. But these other leaders can see clearly, and they're saying, Achish, this doesn't make sense. Send this guy back home. We can't fight with him. We can't trust him. What better strategy than to say that he's our buddy, and then in the middle of battle, he's going to divide our forces and win loyalty back to Saul? This is the same guy. Isn't this the same guy that had that top hit song of the 1600 BC? You know, it was on the radio all the time. Everybody got sick of it. Saul is slaying his thousands, and David is tens of thousands. You know that tune, right? I know I'm being a little, facetious here, but in reality, everybody knew who David was. Everybody knew that this was the champion of Israel. Every Philistine would know him because he conquered their giant. And they're saying, dude, it wasn't that long ago that this was the most hated man in all of Philistia, and now we're supposed to fight side by side with him? Now, it's important to remember that as sticky as the situation is, it could have been all avoided if David would have sought God's will and planned and not settled in the enemy camp. So often in life, we're like, God, why did you put me in this situation? Why do I find myself here? Why am I stuck here? And so often we blame God when we're in the middle of a tough situation, when on all reality, we end up in that situation because our choices led us there, and it wasn't God at all. David would not be in the situation where he and his men are in the enemy camp, surrounded by the entire enemy army, and they're debating whether or not he should be one of them or not. Thankfully, in God's graciousness, they don't say, hey, let's just kill him and wipe him out. They say, send him home to Ziklag. You know, your lies and deception can only be hidden for so long. And David has forgotten the words of his own psalm. Does anyone want to long life and be prosperous, then don't live by lies. Well, now he's trapped. Verses 6 through 11. So Achish finally summoned David and said to him, I swear by the Lord that you have been a trustworthy ally. I think you should go with me into battle, for I've never found a single flaw in you from the day you arrived until today. But the other Philistine rulers, well, they won't hear of it. Please don't upset them, but go back quietly. What have I done to deserve this treatment? David demanded. What have you ever found in your servant? And I can't go and fight the enemies of my lord the king. But Achish insisted, as far as I'm concerned, you are as perfect as an angel of God. But the Philistine commanders are afraid to have you with them in battle. Now, get up early in the morning and leave with your men as soon as it gets light. So David and his men headed back into the land of the Philistines, while the Philistine army went on to Jezreel. We read this and we're like, wow, man, David just dodged a bullet, right? Instead of killing him, they're sending him home. And not only that, he has Achish apologizing to him why he can't go into battle. I mean, this guy is so fooled. He's got the wool so over his eyes that he can't see the reality of the situation. And to be honest with you, it makes me mad. Doesn't it make you mad when people live by lies and deception and they seem to get away with it? I mean, that makes me so upset. And I know we've got every news source possible, and you can find a news station or website that matches your belief system or whatever else. One thing we can agree on is that there is corruption in our nation, right? There is not a consistent standard, and it makes me mad. So when David deserves to get caught for his lies and all the atrocities that he's done, it isn't fair that he gets away. And to make it worse, David milks the situation. Oh, darn it! I really wanted to go and you. What did I do wrong? I thought we were buddies. Like, he not just says, oh, okay. He really makes it look like he's Achish's friend. And some people really marvel at his moxie in this situation. I think of like the show Big Brother or Survivor. Like, David would be a great contestant because they're always creating alliances on those shows, right? And usually the person that wins is the guy that makes like 2 or 3 different alliances, and right at the right moment, they betray one group and join another and all the rest. And man, David would play that game really well. Achish literally thinks he's a perfect angel of God. Barf. What does Satan think about that? Satan, the angel of light. Here's David, God's anointed, a man after God's own heart, living by lies and deception, and Achish says, you're like an angel of God to me. And God's going, oh. And the devil's going, yay! He looks like me. David gets out of this and he gets to go home. And this isn't fair. And it's not fair, but it's grace. David may not be suffering for these poor decisions now, but he will one day. One day when David becomes king of Israel, he's going to tell God, I want to build you a temple, a place to glorify your name and your presence. You know what God tells David? You can't. There's too much blood on your hands. You shed innocent blood. I can't have you do it. Or when David gets old and gray and it's time for him to pass on his kingship, his sons from some of his different wives end up arguing and fighting and killing each other, and one son betrays him to the point where David has to flee from his life for Jerusalem, and this son defiles his wives. So it's going to catch up to David eventually. Let me tell you guys, nobody gets away with anything. In this moment, it seems like David gets off without consequences. But for whatever reason, God's not through with David. We want David to suffer from his bad choices because justice demands it. But let's put ourselves in David's shoes here this morning. I know this group. You guys never lied before in your life, never deceived anybody, never took advantage of anybody else. I know who you are, but let's just pretend that at some point you lied or deceived or took advantage of somebody else. Were you thankful when God was gracious with you? and loved you and forgave you, even though you deserved strong consequences for the decisions and choices and things you said and did? Of course you are. See, the thing is, we want judgment for other people, but we want grace for ourselves. That's a huge problem for us. And so we need to look at things through the eyes of God. Does David deserve everything that's coming to him? Sure he does. But David, ultimately, God's plan for David is for him to be the greatest king of Israel. Jesus would come through the line of David. And so even though he's at a low point, even though he's far from God, God has a longer perspective. The same thing is true of Saul, who would become Paul one day. When he comes to Jesus, when Jesus reveals himself to him on the road of Damascus, the believers in Damascus say, we don't want to be around this guy. He's thrown us into prison. He's killed us. He says terrible things about Jesus. How can we show him grace? And God says, because I did. Thanks be to Jesus that he called Peter back after Peter left Jesus 3 times. Or Jacob himself. Jacob was called Israel after he wrestled with God, and then he moved his family to Shechem, where his daughter was defiled, and 2 of his sons destroyed the whole city because of his bad choice. Thank God, God called him again and said, you're not acting like Israel. Or even Abraham. Let's go back to the first patriarch. Thankfully, God was gracious to him. After twice, he told 2 separate kings, this beautiful 90-year-old woman is not my wife, she's my sister. He threw his wife under the bus for his own protection. You see, the Bible is full of people that deserve justice and got grace instead. And I'm sure David was a ball of emotions. Yeah, he got off scot-free, it seems, but the Philistines are still heading for his homeland, and he's still going to fight against the people he's called to protect. And because of his decision to live in the enemy camp, he's unable to fight for and to protect his people. Anytime we put our rights in front of God's call or the rights of others, we put ourselves on the sideline of God's calling and grace. I deserve, I need, I have to have. In this situation, David, instead of fighting to protect his people against their enemy, almost had to fight for the enemy, and now he's on the sidelines because he wanted comfort, he wanted protection, and he wanted peace for himself. Chapter 30, verses 1 through 6. 3 days later, when David and his men arrived at their home of Ziklag, they found that the Amalekites had made a raid in the Negev and Ziklag, and they had crushed Ziklag and burned it to the ground. They had carried off the women and children and everyone else, but without killing anyone. When David and his men saw the ruins and realized what had happened to their families, they wept until they could weep no more. David's 2 wives, Ahinoam from Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel, were among those captured. And David was now in great danger because all his men were very bitter about losing their sons and daughters, and they began to talk of stoning him. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Everything eventually will always come around full circle. When the Philistines have mustered their forces to attack the Israelites, they've left their homes defenseless. And so the Philistines were famous for their raiding parties. Well, now the Amalekites have raided the raiders. And while the whole army is ready to face Israel, the Amalekites have come through and just plundered and destroyed cities in their wake. And one of the cities that they pillaged and destroyed was David's home of Ziklag, the very place that David compromised his calling and his faith and trust in Jesus, the very place that he traded it in for to live in his enemy camp for his comfort and his safety and his protection. Everything that he owned, everything that he had has been burned into dust. And everyone that him and his men love have been taken as prisoners and slaves. He shows up after a 3-day ride to find only charred embers. Proverbs 21:6 says, wealth created by a lying tongue is a vanishing mist and a deadly trap. David's nose can attest to the truth of that proverb because all he valued is dust in the wind. It's by God's grace that no one was killed, even though everybody is captured. And the result? David and his men are crushed. Why did God allow David to escape the wrath of the Philistines? Because God wanted to reach him in a different way. God disciplines us not for our destruction, but for our good. God wasn't done with David. The Philistines could have killed him and his men right then and there, but God wasn't done. God wanted to bring him back home to the very thing that he valued more than anything else and say, look at the result of the life you've chosen. You've lost everything. He shows them what lies actually gains. He crushes every last man. Crushes is the word used here. You ever been crushed before? If you haven't yet, it's not if, it's when. Crushed! And it says that all these men are so crushed that they have no more tears to shed. Now, I have no trouble crying. You guys have seen me cry lots of times. It's a genetic thing. We just do it. But I know a lot of men grow up where they don't cry. They don't shed tears. They're told to be a man, you don't cry. Well, these guys have literally lost everything. Everything they love, everything they've hoped for, and they've got nothing less. They're emotionally spent. So they go on this roller coaster of having to face their people. They get freed from that. They have this 3 days, and I don't know what they thought about or talked about in those 3 days. Maybe some of them were burdened that they weren't in the battle to protect God's people, and other ones are just happy that they got away scot-free, and they come home to nothing. On top of that, the men who have stood by David through thick and thin, the men that found David when he was in the wilderness, the men that fled with David from Saul to place, the men that would fight for David and kill Saul no matter what, those men have now turned on David. Do you know why? Because David isn't the same man he was when they started following him. They walked the journey with David where they have lied and deceived and killed and plundered for their own benefit, and now they see what it's costed them, and that relationship and that trust with David is broken, and now they're talking about stoning him to death. What'll David do? What would you do? David could try to blame someone else. It's typically what we do in our political landscape, right? Hey, it's not my fault, it's your fault. It's his fault, it's her fault. He could continue to lie, downward spiral. He could take his own life. That's eventually the choice that Saul makes. Or David could think to himself, like he did before, that got him in that place in the first place. What makes it sting all the more, the deeper message within a message is the people group that just destroyed Ziklag and took all of their friends and family, their children away from them, is the very people group that God had called Saul to bring his judgment upon, and Saul wasn't obedient. He kept the best and the healthy and the beautiful from among the Amalekites and didn't bring God's wrath down. And that's why David was called to be the next king, because of Saul's disobedience when it came to the Amalekites. And so God's deeper message to David within the message of Ziklag being destroyed is, look at who you've become. The Amalekites, those that are still in existence because of the disobedience of your predecessor, are now bringing judgment upon you. Are you going to be Saul, or are you going to be my kind of king? On the verge of his own destruction, the end verse says, but David found strength in the Lord his God. David was who he was not because he was perfect and made the right choices all the time. I'm so glad he didn't. It gives me hope for me. David was who he was because God reached out and showed him grace, and David responded. David's looking at the place that used to be his house. He's seeing everything he lost. The message from God is clear. Son, it's time to come home. Son, you tried it on your own. You tried to do it your own way. Wasn't it better living in a cave with me than living in the enemy territory without me? All that you've lived for, all that you've strived, all that you've accumulated, what's it done for you now? Folks, we can relate. We've been through crushings. We have times where we value things we shouldn't. I do think there's a spirit in our culture of consumerism and distraction where we allow ourselves to spend so much time and so much money and so much effort to our entertainment that we are not fulfilling the Great Commission and sharing the gospel with a lost and dying world that's desperate for Him. And God says, time to come home. Now, has He burned up your Ziklag? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you should pray, God, I can't give it up. You're going to have to take it from me. Either way, in this moment, David is realizing what's truly valuable. You see, in that moment, the Lord was all that David had. His reputation was damaged. His trust with his men was broken. He had no home, no family, and no hope apart from the promises of God. Much like Saul in the previous chapter, David sees the size of his enemy, and it's even his own men. Saul says, I'm going to try to coerce God to do what I want him to do, and I'm going to use witchcraft and manipulation. And David just says, okay, God, okay, I'm done. I'm yours now. I leave it all to you. I want to look back at Psalm 34, verses 4 through 6. I prayed to the Lord, and He answered me. He freed me from all my fears. Those who look to Him for help will be radiant with joy. No shadow of shame will darken their faces. In my desperation I prayed, and the Lord listened. He saved me from all my troubles. In verse 18, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He rescues those whose spirits are crushed. Today, God's trying to get our attention. There's either one of two ways that God is calling you to respond to this sermon. Either you are like David and you are inhabiting a Ziklag in the enemy camp. You have put roots down on this earth in the enemy camp where God is saying, you're compromising too much and I need to uproot you. And you need to get back to valuing me more than anything else. Or the second is this: you're too judgmental. Instead of offering grace and praying for God to reach people that are lost and dying and living by the lie, you're only calling for their judgment. And you're becoming judgmental yourself when you yourself has been a recipient of God's grace undeservedly. And that's the beauty of the gospel, is that God's grace is available to the least, the lost, and the lonely. Did David deserve this grace and a second chance? No. But who does? Who does? If God wasn't done with David, He isn't done with you. I doubt that any of you have done anything as awful as David has done within these 16 months. There is hope for you, and you can become exactly who God designed you to be. Yes, there's going to be scars. Yes, there's going to be consequences from your poor choices. But Jesus says, hey, I still have a plan for you. Now, the rest of chapter 30 is about David trying to rescue his family and the families of his men. I don't even want to touch it this morning because I want to leave us in the pit. I want to leave you in the decision. Man, nobody likes being in a pit. But if you get out of the pit too quick, you forget about what it's like to be in the pit, right? And so I want you to just sit in this moment of indecision and embrace, well, do I want to stay here in the wreckage because it used to be great? Or do I want to get out of the wreckage and follow Jesus and start a new chapter? Pastor Sean related about Nancy Liston moving to Arizona and joining her brother, starting a new chapter in her life because, she doesn't have much family here left besides us, her church family, and how hard a decision that is. Nancy's had her ups and downs and had her challenges in life, and I've seen God grow in her so great. But what David has to do here in many ways, and Nancy's situation isn't about sin, it's just about being obedient to to Jesus saying, your life from this point forward is not in the West Virginia you love, but in the Arizona with your family. But that's a huge, drastic choice and change. And to follow Jesus, sometimes that's what it takes, is us to be in the pit for a little bit and look around us and say, oh, the life that I've lived by deception and self-focus and self-centeredness, it's not really that great. There are so many people out there that realize that they're living a perpetual lie, but they won't get help because they don't want to admit that they've made wrong choices. It's pride. Well, let your pride burn up in the flames. Find the Jesus and the life he has for you and the joy that's awaiting you. David didn't stay in the ruins of Ziklag. David didn't allow his men to take his life. He turned his heart back to God. He remembered the promises of God, and he got up out of that dust, and he still became the future king of Israel. God has a plan for you. Now believe it. Lord, I thank you and praise you for the power of your word. We are recipients of your grace undeservedly. Help us to remember. Help us to remember the pits that you pulled us out of. Help us to remember the value of things that we attain in the enemy camp. Everything that we accumulate in this life will burn, except for our relationship with you. You are the only thing of value in this world, you and the humanity that you've created. And so, Lord, let us live for the right things. Help us to remember and experience that grace from you once again so that we can be gracious to others. Help us, Lord God, to have a legacy like David, where we may have had shortcomings and pitfalls and things we're not proud of, but ultimately we surrendered to you, we remembered and called out to you, and you lifted us up. In your name we pray. Amen. Just respond as God leads you this morning.